time, and we are going to read one of my very favorite Tolkien short stories called Leaf by Niggle. Super weird title, super cool story. And I hope everyone's doing well this morning. Happy Saturday. I hope you have a cup of tea. I am drinking English breakfast with milk and sugar, as one does. And this is like one of my favorite teacups that my aunt gave me for Christmas. Thank you, Aunt Liesel. And we discovered these teacups at an Airbnb we stayed in, SoCal. We fell in love with these teacups and we just drank out of them every day, and they made us so happy. And now we all have our own, thanks to my aunt who finds cool things like the exact same teacup as she does. So I hope you have a great teacup and a great cup of tea, and you're ready for a great story. Yes, I certainly am. Yeah, I don't know about you, but I could use a story right about now. And I was reading a really cool book about how stories, like fairy tales, even as children, inspire deep courage, even as adults. So, something that you read as a child might be in the back of your mind, reminding you, oh, yeah, you can fight against the giant and win, and you can slay the dragon. And so I just thought, anytime we're in need of a story, to read one. So I need a story today. So we're going to read one of my favorites. It's if you're just joining, it's called Leaf by Niggle, and it is a Tolkien story. Now I have a well, thank you and a confession. So thank you to my Aunt Heather for introducing me to this story. She read it to her boys, and they loved it, and it was like their favorite story. And she recommended it to me a few years back. And the first time I read it, I was like, oh, how have I never read this before? This is amazing. And then the second confession I have is Tolkien is really famous for who knows what book. Anyone can type in the comments. What did Tolkien write? I'm talking about J.R.R. Tolkien. He was one of the Inklings. He was friends with C.S. Lewis. They used to hang out in a pub in Oxford called The Eagle and Child, or The Bird and the Baby, as it was called. And I mean, I frequented that place when I lived in Oxford, and it's really cool. I had a cup of tea with C.S. Lewis's portrait. But we're going to read Leaf by Niggle. So grab your cup of tea, and we are going to read a story. And J.R.R. Tolkien is famous for the Lord of the Rings series. And my confession is, I never read it. I know, I read The Hobbit in high school, and then I stopped. And I've also never seen the movies. And tell me how atrocious that is in the chat box, please. Okay, without further ado, we're going to read Leaf by Niggle. Okay, so here we go. I think everyone can hear okay, I'm hoping. Also, happy birthday to my Grandpa Floyd. Happy birthday, Grandpa. I don't know if you've ever heard this story, but I think you'd like it. So we're going to go ahead and start. Leaf by Niggle. And away we go. Okay. There was a little man called Niggle who had a long journey to make. He did not want to go. Indeed, the whole idea was distasteful to him, but he could not get out of it. He knew he would have to start sometime, but he did not hurry in his preparation. Niggle was a painter, not a very successful one, partly because he had many other things to do. Most of those things, he thought, were a nuisance, but he did them fairly well when he could not get out of them, which in his opinion was far too often. The laws in his country were rather strict. There were other hindrances too. For one thing, he was sometimes just idle and did nothing at all. For another, he was kind-hearted in a way. You know, the sort of kind heart. It made him uncomfortable more than it made him do anything, even when he did anything. It did not prevent him from grumbling, losing his temper, and swearing, mostly to himself. All the time, all the same, it did land him in a good many odd jobs for his neighbor, Mr. Parrish, a man with a lame leg. Occasionally, he even helped other people from farther off, if they came and asked him to. And now and again, he remembered his journey and began to pack a few things in an ineffectual way, and at such times he did not paint very much. He had a number of pictures on hand. Most of these were too large and ambitious for his skill. He was the sort of painter who can paint leaves better than trees. He used to spend a long time on a single leaf, trying to catch its shape, its sheen, and the glistening of dewdrops on its edges. Yet he wanted to paint a whole tree with all of its leaves in the same style and all of them different. There was one picture in particular which bothered him. It had begun with a leaf caught in the wind, and it became a tree, and the tree grew, sending out innumerable branches and thrusting out the most fantastic roots. Strange birds came and settled on the twigs, and they had to be attended to. Then all around the tree, and behind it, through the gaps of the leaves and the boughs, a country began to open out, and there were glimpses of a forest marching over the land, and of mountains tipped with snow. Niggle lost interest in his other pictures, or else he took them and tacked them onto the edges of his great picture. Soon the canvas became so large that he had to get a ladder, and he ran up and down it, putting in a touch here, rubbing out a patch there. When people came to call, he seemed polite enough, though he fiddled a little with the pencil at the desk. He listened to what they said, but underneath was thinking all the time about his big canvas in the tall shed that he had built for it out in his garden, on a plot where he had once grown potatoes. He could not get rid of his kind heart. I wish I had more of a strong mind, he sometimes said to himself, meaning that he wished other people's troubles did not make him feel uncomfortable. But for a long time, he was not seriously perturbed. At any rate, I shall get this one picture done, my real picture, before I have to go on that wretched journey, he used to say. Yet he was beginning to see that he could not put off his start indefinitely. The picture would have to stop just growing and get finished. One day, Niggle stood a little way off from his picture and considered it with unusual attention and detachment. He could not make up his mind what he thought about it, and he wished he had some friend who would tell him what to think. Actually, it seemed to him wholly unsatisfactory and yet lovely, the only really beautiful picture in the world. What he would have liked at that moment would have been to see himself walk in and slap him on the back and say with obvious sincerity, "Absolutely magnificent! I see exactly what you are getting at. Do get on with it and don't bother about anything else. We will arrange for a public pension so that you need not." However, there was no public pension. And one thing he could see, it would need some concentration, some work, some uninterrupted work to finish the picture, even at its present size. He rolled up his sleeves and began to concentrate. He tried for several days not to bother about other things, but there came a tremendous crop of interruptions. Things went wrong in his house. He had to go and serve on a jury in the town. A distant friend fell ill. Mr. Parrish was laid up with lumbago. The visitors kept on coming. It was springtime. They wanted a free tea in the country. And Niggle lived in a pleasant little house miles away from the town. He cursed them in his heart, but he could not deny that he had invited them himself away back in the winter when he had not thought about it as an interruption to visit the shops and have tea with acquaintances in the town. He tried to harden his heart, but it was not a success. There were many things that he had not the face to say no to, whether he thought them duties or not. And there were some things that he was compelled to do, whatever he thought. Some of his visitors hinted that his garden was rather neglected and that he might get a visit from the inspector. Very few of them knew about his picture, of course, but if they had known, it would not have made much difference. I doubt if they would have thought that it mattered much. I dare say it was not really a very good picture, though it may have had some good passages. The tree, at any rate, was curious, quite unique in its own way. So was Niggle, though he was also very ordinary and rather a silly little man. Okay, what do we think so far? Niggle wants to paint a tree. Well, he wants to paint leaves, but lots of them in great detail and all different. And he keeps getting interrupted. Does any of this ring a bell? Is anyone feeling the same way? Anyone have any artists or makers or people who like making things and maybe you get interrupted and you just want to make your thing and you want to do your art. Okay, let's find out what happens next. So Niggle is rather a silly little man, but what happens next? At length, Niggle's time became really precious. His acquaintances in the distant town began to remember that the little man had got to make a troublesome journey, and some began to calculate how long at the latest he could put off starting. They wondered who would take his house, and if the garden would be better kept. The autumn came very wet and windy. The little painter was in his shed. He was up on the ladder, trying to catch the gleam of the westering sun on the peak of the snow mountain, which he had just glimpsed just to the left of the leafy tip of one of the tree's branches. He knew that he would have to be leaving soon, perhaps early next year. He could only just get the picture finished, and only so at that. There were some corners where he would not have the time now to do more than hint at what he wanted. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," he said sharply, and climbed down the ladder. He stood on the floor, twiddling his brush. It was his neighbor, Parrish, his only real neighbor. All other folks lived a long way off. Still, he did not like the man very much, partly because he was so often in trouble and in need of help, and also because he did not come to care about painting, but was critical about gardening. When Parrish looked at Niggle's garden, which was often, he saw mostly weeds, and when he looked at Niggle's picture, which was seldom, he saw only green and gray patches and black lines, which seemed to him nonsensical. He did not mind mentioning the weeds, a neighborly duty, but he refrained from giving any opinion of the pictures. He thought this was very kind, and he did not realize that even if it was kind, it was not kind enough. He thought to help with the weeds and perhaps praise for the picture would have been better. "Well, Parrish, what is it?" said Niggle. "I oughtn't interrupt you, I know," said Parrish, without a glance at the picture. "You are very busy, I'm sure." Niggle had meant to say something like that himself, but he had missed his chance. All he said was, "Yes." "But I've no one else to turn to," said Parrish. "Quite so," said Niggle with a sigh, one of those sighs that are a private comment, but which are not made quite audible. "What can I do for you?" "My wife has been ill for some days, and I'm getting worried," said Parrish, "and the wind has blown half the tiles off my roof, and water is pouring into the bedroom. I think I ought to get the doctor, and the builders too, only they take so long to come. I was wondering if you had any wood and canvas you could spare just to patch me up and see me through for a day or two." Now he did look at the picture. "Dear, dear," said Niggle, "you are unlucky. I hope it is no more than a cold that your wife has got. I'll come round presently and help you move the patient downstairs." "Thank you very much," said Parrish, rather coolly. "But it's not a cold, it's a fever." "I should not have bothered you for a cold. And my wife is in bed downstairs already. I can't get up and down with trays, not with my leg, but I see you are busy. Sorry to have troubled you. I would rather hoped you might have been able to spare some time to go for the doctor, seeing how I'm placed, and the builder too, if you really have no canvas you can spare." "Of course," said Niggle, though other words were in his heart, which at the moment were merely soft, without feeling at all kind. "I could go. I'll go if you are really worried." "I am worried, very worried. I wish I was not lame," said Parrish. So Niggle went. You see, it was awkward. Parrish was his neighbor, and everyone else a long way off. Niggle had a bicycle, and Parrish had not, and could not ride one. Parrish had a lame leg, a genuine lame leg, which gave him a good deal of pain, and had to be remembered, as well as his sour expression and whining voice. Of course, Niggle had a picture, and barely time to finish it, but it seemed that this was a thing that Parrish had to reckon with, and not Niggle. Parrish, however, did not reckon with pictures, and Niggle could not alter that. Curse it, he said to himself, and got out his bicycle. It was wet and windy, and daylight was waning. No more work for me today, thought Niggle, and all the time he was writing, he was either swearing to himself or imagining the strokes of his brush on the mountain and the spray of leaves beside it, and he had first imagined in the spring. His fingers twitched on the handlebars. Now he was out in the shed. He saw exactly the way in which to treat that shining spray which framed the distant vision of the mountain. But he had a sinking feeling in his heart, a sort of fear that he would never now get a chance to try it out. Niggle found the doctor, and he left a note at the builder's. The office was shut, and the builder had gone home to be by his fireside. Niggle got soaked to the skin and caught a chill himself. The doctor did not set out as promptly as Niggle had done. He arrived the next day, which was quite convenient for him, as by that time there were 2 patients to deal with in neighboring houses. Niggle was in bed with a high temperature, and marvelous patterns of leaves and involved branches forming in his head and on the ceiling. It did not comfort him to learn that Mrs. Parrish had only a cold and was getting up. He turned his face to the wall and buried himself in the leaves. He remained in bed some time. The wind went on blowing. It took away a good many more of Parrish's tiles, and some of Niggle's as well. His own roof began to leak. The builder did not come. Niggle did not care for a day or 2. Then he crawled out to look for some food. Niggle had no wife. Parrish did not come round. The rain had got into his leg and made it ache. And his wife was busy mopping up water and wondering if that Mr. Niggle had forgotten to call up the builders. Had she seen any chance of borrowing anything useful, she would have sent Parrish round, leg or not, but she did not, so Niggle was left to himself. At the end of a week or so, Niggle tottered out to his shed again. He tried to climb the ladder, but it made his head giddy. He sat and looked at the picture, but there were no patterns or leaves or visions or mountains in his mind that day. He could have painted a far-off view of a sandy desert, but he had not the energy. Next day, he felt a good deal better. He climbed the ladder and began to paint. He had just begun to get into it again when there came a knock at the door. Darn, said Niggle, but he might just as well have said, come in, politely, for the door opened all the same. This time, a very tall man came in, a total stranger. This is a private studio, said Niggle. I'm busy, go away. I am an inspector of houses, said the man, holding out his appointment card so that Niggle on his ladder could see it. He said. Your neighbor's house is not satisfactory at all, said the inspector. I know, said Niggle. I took a note to the builders not a long time ago, but they have never come. Then I became ill. I see, said the inspector, but you are not ill now. With literally no shame, Inspector. I know, said Niggle, but I'm not a builder. Parrish ought to make a complaint to the town council and get help from the emergency service. They are busy with worse damage than up here, said the inspector. There has to be a flood in the valley, and many families are homeless. You should have helped your neighbor to make temporary repairs and prevent the damage from getting more costly to mend than necessary. That's the law. There is plenty of material here, canvas, wood, waterproof paint. Where? Said Niggle indignantly. There, said the inspector, pointing to the picture. My picture, exclaimed Niggle. I dare say it is, said the inspector. The house has come first. That's the law. But I can't. Niggle said no more, for at that moment another man came in. Very much like the inspector he was, almost his double, tall, dressed in black. Come along, he said. I'm the driver. Niggle stumbled from the ladder. His fever seemed to have come on again, and his head was swimming. He felt cold all over. Driver? Driver, he chattered. Driver of what? You and your carriage, said the man. The carriage was ordered long ago. It has come at last. It's waiting. You start today on your journey, you know. There now, said the inspector. You have to go. But it's a bad way to start on your long journey, leaving your jobs undone. Still, we can at last make some use of this canvas now. Oh dear, said poor Niggle, beginning to weep. And it's not even finished. Not finished, said the driver. Well, it's finished with as far as you're concerned at any rate. Come along. Niggle went quite quietly. The driver gave him no time to pack, saying he ought to have done that before, and they would miss the train. So all Niggle could do was grab a little bag in the hall. He found that it contained only a paint box and a small book of his own sketches, neither food nor clothes. They caught the train all right. Niggle was feeling very tired and sleepy. He was hardly aware of what was going on when they bundled him into the compartment. He did not care much. He had forgotten where he was supposed to be going or what he was going for. The train ran almost at once into a dark tunnel. Niggle woke up in a very large, dim railway station. A porter went along the platform shouting, but he was not shouting the name of the place. He was shouting, "Niggle!" Niggle got out in a hurry and found that he had left his little bag behind. He turned back, but the train had gone away. "Ah, there you are," said the porter. "This way. What, no luggage? You will have to go to the workhouse." Niggle felt very ill and fainted on the platform. They put him in an ambulance and took him to the workhouse infirmary. He did not like the treatment at all. The medicine they gave him was bitter. The officials in attendance were unfriendly, silent, and strict, and he never saw anyone else except for a very severe doctor who visited him occasionally. It was like being in a prison. He had to work very hard, at stated hours, at digging, carpentry, and painting bare boards, all one plain color. He was never allowed outside, and the windows all looked inwards. They kept him in the dark for hours at a stretch to do some thinking, they said. He lost count of time. He did not even begin to feel better. Not that it could be judged by whether he felt any pleasure in doing anything. He did not even in going to bed. At first, during the first century or so, I am merely giving his impressions, he used to worry aimlessly about the past. One thing he kept on repeating himself as he lay in the dark: "I wish I had called on Parrish the first morning after the high winds began. I meant to. The first loose tiles would have been easy to fix. Then Mrs. Parrish might never have caught cold. Then I should not have caught cold either. Then I should have had a week longer." But in time he forgot what it was that he had wanted a week longer for. If he had worried at all about that, it was about his job at the hospital. He planned them out, thinking how quickly he could stop board creaking, or rehang the door, or mend the table leg. Probably he really became rather useful, though no one ever told him so. But that, of course, could not be the reason why they kept the poor little man for so long. They might have been waiting for him to get better, and judging better by some odd medical standard of their own. At any rate, poor Niggle got no pleasure out of life. Not what he had been used to call pleasure. He was certainly not amused, but it could not be denied that after he began to have a feeling of, well, satisfaction, bread rather than jam. He could take up a task at the moment one bell rang, and lay it aside promptly that moment, and the next one went well, all tidy and ready to be continued at the right time. He got through quite a lot in one day now. He finished small things off neatly. He had no time of his own, except alone in his bed cell, and yet he was becoming a master of his time. He began to know just what he could do with it. There was no sense of rush. He was quieter inside now, and at resting time he could really rest. Then suddenly they changed all his hours. They hardly let him go to bed at all, and they took him off carpentry altogether and kept him at plain digging day after day. He took it fairly well. It was a long while before he ever began to grope in the back of his mind for the curses that he had practically forgotten. He went on digging till his back seemed broken, his hands were raw, and he felt that he might not manage another spadeful. Nobody thanked him, but the doctor came and looked at him. "Knock off," he said, "complete rest in the dark." Niggle was laying in the dark, resting completely, so that, as he had not been either feeling or thinking at all, he might have been laying there for hours or for years, as far as he could tell. But now he heard voices, not voices he had ever heard before. there seemed to be a medical ward or perhaps a court of inquiry going on close at hand in an adjoining room with the door open possibly, though he could not see any light. "Now the Niggle case," said a voice, a very severe voice, more severe than the doctor's. "What was the matter with him?" said the second voice, a voice that you might have called gentle, though it was not soft. It was a voice of authority, and it sounded at once hopeful and sad. What was the matter with Niggle? His heart was in the right place. "Yes, but it did not function properly," said the first voice, "and his head was not screwed on tight enough. He hardly ever thought at all. Look at all the time he wasted, not even amusing himself. He never got ready for his journey. He was moderately well off, yet he arrived here almost destitute and had to be put in the pauper's wing. A bad case, I'm afraid. I think he should stay some time yet." "It would not do him any harm, perhaps," said the second voice, "but of course he is only a little man. He was never meant to be anything very much, and he was never very strong. Let us look at the records. Yes, there are some favorable points, you know." "Perhaps," said the first, "but very few that will really bear examination." What on earth is going on over here? Well, said the second voice, "there are these. He was a painter by nature. In a minor way, of course. Still, Leaf by Niggle has a charm of its own. He took a great deal of pains with leaves, just for their own sake, but he never thought that made him important. There's no note of record of his pretending, even to himself, that it excused his neglect of things ordered by the law." "Then he should not have neglected so many," said the first voice. "All the same, he did answer a good many calls. A small percentage, mostly of the easier sort, and he called those interruptions. The records are full of the word, together with a lot of complaints and silly words." "True, but they look like interruptions to him, of course, poor little man, and there is this. He never expected any return, and so many of his sort call it. There's the Parrish case, the one that came in later. He was Niggle's neighbor, never did a stroke for him, and seldom showed any gratitude at all. But there's no note in the records that Niggle expected Parrish's gratitude. He does not seem to have even thought about it." "Yes, that is a point," said the first voice, "but rather small. I think you will find Niggle often merely forgot. Things he had to do for Parrish he put out of his mind as a nuisance he had to be done with." "Still, there is that last report," said the second voice, "the wet bicycle ride. I rather lay stress on that. It seems plain that this was a genuine sacrifice. Niggle guessed that he was throwing away his last chance with his picture, and he guessed, too, that Parrish was worrying unnecessarily." "I think you put it too strongly," said the first voice. "But you have the last word. It's your task, of course, to put the best interpretation to the facts. Sometimes they will bear it. What do you propose?" "I think this case requires a little gentle treatment now," said the second voice. Niggle thought that he had never heard anything so generous as that voice. It made gentle treatment sound like a load of rich gifts and the summons to a king's feast. Then suddenly Niggle felt ashamed. To hear that he was considered a case for gentle treatment overwhelmed him and made him blush in the dark. It was like being publicly praised, when you and all the audience know that the praise was not deserved. Niggle hid his blushes in the rough blanket. There was a silence. The first voice spoke to Niggle quite close. "You have been listening," it said. "Yes," said Niggle. "Well, what do you have to say?" And that is the perfect place to pause. And we're going to find out what happens to Niggle next time. What do we think so far about Leaf by Niggle? Very different type of story. Hi, P. Mary. Oh, thank you for the flowers. It's so good to see you. I'm glad you're here. I love this story. I think this story resonates with anybody who is creative, anyone who makes things. But I think it's a very human story too. And I've been thinking about this story a lot lately because we started reading stories on March 13th when we started sheltering in place. And in a lot of places, doors are being opened and we're kind of stepping into whatever the new normal is. And it's bringing up a lot of things, isn't it? What is it going to be like out there when we go back? It's going to be different. And something about this story brings me a lot of comfort. So maybe you too. The voices just ask Niggle what he has to say for himself. And we're going to find out what he does have to say for himself next time. But I hope you enjoy your cups of tea and your Saturday morning and your story. This is a story maybe for children, but mostly for adults. And I think this is a story for creative people. So if you make things, if you paint or compose, or if you music, or if you do words, this is for you. My earring fell off. Just gave up. Okay, I think that's a sign that it's time to wrap it up, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good Saturday.